Hello, I'm back and I am going to read you chapter 4 on the memoirs of Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. She's lived to be 102 years old, so she's no longer, obviously alive. And this is Prince Richard, the current Duke of Gloucester's mother. And she aged so well. She looks really. This is a picture of her at 80. She lived a very long time, saw a lot of changes from no electricity in homes, no water in homes, to, a whole different change of the way they used to do and travel on progress within the ducal homes to the present day, modern day way of doing things. Saw two world wars. She spent time in Kenya and she really did her duty. So I just think that people like her and the Gloucesters and the Kents, they really need to be recognized. And I'm looking back to, prior to World War One and World War Two, and because those times need to be remembered today, why we love our country so much, why we love Britain or why we love America, and the devastation of what these wars do, and how we don't want another war, but in my opinion, I am reading these because, it really highlights the role of how Princess Anne, how Prince Edward are just doing a fabulous job as our uh, the Gloucester and the Kents. They do a really wonderful job of supporting their current monarch, who would be their cousin or their uncle, and they need good notice for what they do. So it's quite a sacrifice, and I personally wish Harry had gone another way. I think he was raised to do this, but he just went a whole different way. And so many people are out there talking about him and Meghan right now, but these people here that do their duty, they aren't getting the notice. And that's why I'm reading this. So, chapter 4. My father, being the second son, who was never expected to succeed to the title, he was educated at the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, and I had been told was destined for a brilliant career in the Navy, and his elder brother not expectedly died. That's a lot like George V. I mean, his brother, died from an influenza. And so at the age of 12, as a midshipman, he went to Australia and to the Far East in Boughton and was commanded by my great uncle, Lord Charles Scott. Also on board as naval cadets were the two sons of the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Clarence, and Prince George. The later time to succeed his father as George V. The latter in time to succeed his father as George V. They were accompanied by their tutor, Mr. Dalton, and as a result, this trip, King George and my father remained always the best of friends. Mr. Dalton afterwards submitted an exhaustive report on the voyage to Queen Victoria and the Prince and Princess of Wales, who does not describe anything too hazardous as having taken place. It also fails to mention the incident when my great uncle Charles assembled the ship's company before docking at Sydney and warned them about the many attractive girls they might find there and the importance of not succumbing to their charms. Before the ship left home, he himself fell in love with and subsequently married my Australian aunt, Ada Ryan. News of the match was received with horror, but my family need not have worried, as Aunt Ada proved, as I've always indicated, a great addition. She was a charming and a delightful person and lived to be 95, and she was loved by us all. My father was still only in his early 20s when in 1886 his elder brother slipped on a wet rock at Etchencarry while stalking. His rifle went off and the bullet pierced an artery in his arm. He bled to death on the long trail home. As a result, my father had to leave the Navy, much to his sorrow, and return home to the responsibilities of a son and heir. In due course, also, to think about marrying. I suspected my two grandmothers busily made plans on his behalf. They were both members of the court. My father's mother, the Duchess of Buccleuch, being the mistress of the robes to Queen Alexandra, my mother's mother, the Countess of Bradford, and lady-in-waiting to the future Queen Mary, then who was the Duchess of York. They knew each other well and were the best of friends. Soon two Bradford daughters, barely out of the schoolroom, the beautiful Lady Beatrice and Lady Margaret Bridgeman, were dispatched to Drumlanrig. I feel sorry for my mother. It's difficult to imagine anyone less well prepared for marriage than she must have been. After her secluded upbringing at her country home in Shropshire, her father, by all accounts, was inconsiderably mean towards his family, and he was interested only in racing and his own health, for the benefit of which he made frequent visits to the spas and to resorts made fashionable by the Prince of Wales, leaving my grandmother with virtually no money and 6 children to bring up. Tugita, short for Granny Ida, always seemed rather serious and reserved, even something of a goody-goody, but my husband told me that in his childhood Ida B., as they called her, had been a great favorite with him, and his brothers and sister very much loved the life and soul of the party. This well illustrated the fact that she had been the first person to fly with the Prince of Wales after he received his license, though she must have been in her 80s at the time. My other grandmother, Louisa, the Duchess of Buccleuch, was also greatly loved and much respected at court. She had a host of friends and a large family to entertain, something she thoroughly enjoyed. A daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Abercorn, she was the eldest in the family of 13, which enabled my father to have 2 uncles younger than himself. At a lunch party at Barnwell, my son William was about 6 years old. The conversation turned the subject of a large and small families. I casually remarked that my grandmother was one of 13. I saw William looking horrified, and when the guest had left, he asked me if what I had said was really true. And I said, "Of course," and I replied. And he said, "Oh, that's dreadful. Did they have to drown some of them?" The Labrador had just had a litter of 11 pups, 5 of which had had to be drowned. It doubtless caused him so much distress and now some confusion. I do not know how long my parents' courtship lasted. They were both very shy, so it may have taken some while. My mother told me that one Sunday when my father was staying at her home, Weston Gita told her family, You're starting a cold. You better not come to church." Mamma was always meek and mild and agreed, though she had not the slightest symptom of a cold. My father said, "Oh, well, I'll stay and keep you company." By the time the church party returned, they were engaged. So I'm going to merge in and show you. This is right here. This was her father, John Charles Montague Douglas Scott. He was the seventh Duke of Buccleuch, the ninth Duke of Queensberry. He he was a politician, he was a military guy. So this was her father. So, and that was her father. Um, in due course, they got married. It was brave of my mother to accept the proposal. She was only 18, and for someone who had never been away from home, it must have been quite alarming to join such a large and boisterous family. As it was, I do not think she ever really blossomed. My father always liked noisy, cheerful people, but my mother found it difficult to compete with social gatherings. We did not see much of her, but when we did, she nearly always seemed to be lying on the sofa or on a long chair in the garden. When my father invited his noisy ladies to stay, Lady Maybelle Howard, who never stopped talking, or Aunt Celia Scarborough, she generally disappeared to the bed with a headache. Her main interest was in her babies, with the boys always being her favorites. Having babies also gave her an excuse, I'm sure, to get away from everyone. This enormous, tiresome family of quarrelsome Scots, her noisy brood of little girls driving her mad. Her favorite child was my youngest brother, George, who was a dear little boy. She doted on him, but luckily he grew up none the worse for this. Her somewhat inadequate education had been shared with three sisters and given by an elderly governess. She had little idea of how to run a house or who was supposed to do what. She left everything to the housekeeper. Housemaids living in freezing cold rooms in the attics, that sort of thing, simply did not concern her. My sister-in-law, Rachel Scott, remembers her visiting Bull Hall towards the end of her life and being excited to discover it had a basement. Where she imagined the food had been cooked, one cannot imagine, and yet she would often make us take the remains of the roly-poly pudding and something equally unsuitable. To old ladies in cottages on the estate who probably did not want it a bit, I always felt sorry for her, even when I was a child. My father seemed continually to be away at that time, and she can scarcely have known anyone outside her family before marrying him. The visits she made with us children to Hyde Park, wearing the extraordinary hat she made herself, sitting on uncomfortable tin chairs, attended by her collection of funny old gentlemen, seem in retrospect all the more pathetic and sad. She must have had suffered from loneliness. My father also hated formal events, but he was sociable enough in his own house. He enjoyed argument and political and historical discussion, voluble men and talkative ladies. He was never at a loss for words and usually the winner of an argument, but was kindness itself beneath it all. His great passion was for trees and for forestry, a subject on which he was well informed. What he most despised of was any kind of pretension. Asked to open up some event at the new club in Edinburgh, he agreed only when he was convinced that there would be no pompous ceremony involved. Arriving in Princess Street on the day, however, he spied from a distance that the Lord Provost and fathers were all dressed to nines and lined up outside the building waiting for him. So he told his chauffeur to stop the Rolls Royce. At the tram stop, he got out, and to the astonishment of the dignitaries, he arrived at the club, stepping off the train. He disliked his tea being too hot, and at functions caused some surprise by sloshing it from the cup to the saucer back and forth again, no doubtedly quietly amused by the horrified expressions as people agonized over whether or not to follow the ducal example. At home, the valet would pour my father's tea about 5 times before he appeared for 9 o'clock breakfast. Nervous young men would come down, seeing this cup waiting to be drunk, and think, I suppose I better take it, only to be mortified a few minutes later by my father furiously demanding to know whether his tea had gone. Breakfast was also the cause of a rift between my father and Lord Frederick Hamilton, one of his two uncles younger than himself. Getting to the dining room rather punctually one morning, Uncle Freddie devoured my father's boiled egg as well as his own. As this took place in the middle of the war at a time of considerable food shortages, one egg represented a fair proportion of the official weekly ration. My father was furious, and he banned him from the house forthwith. But Uncle Freddie was too much of a favorite of us all for the order to hold for more than a week or two. Full of fun and jokes, he usually arrived in a silly disguise of some sort and proceeded to annoy my mother by telling jokes at mealtime. Usually they were rather vulgar ones in a loud voice, making the footman giggle. After the war, my father's dining room troubles were still not at an end. He was particularly pained by the way Lady Victoria Manners hacked the ham, and it became a custom to hide it during her visit. At Langholm, the place chosen was under the typewriter cover in the secretary's room next to the dining room. That poor lady must have had some awful shocks as she settled to the afternoon's work. The war ended and meals returned to their pre-war scale. At breakfast, apart from the array of dishes on the hot plate of porridge, eggs, and bacon, kidneys, sausage, mushrooms, and tomatoes, there would be a ham, a tongue, and, in the appropriate season, a choice of cold game. On top of lunch and tea, there would be enormous dinners of soup, fish, entree, roast, sweet savory cheese, and fruit with a different wine for every course. Roland, who had joined the staff as a schoolroom footman in 1915, remembers a good deal of entertaining going on even during the war. He soon rose to the rank of butler, and later on he became a steward. According to his account, the total staff at the New London House, which was 2 Grosvenor Place, consisted of a steward, a housekeeper, a valet, an under-butler, 2 parlour-maids, 5 housemaids, a cook, 3 kitchen-maids, 2 still-room maids, 2 ladies'-maids, 2 oddmen, a carpenter, steward's room boy, 2 nurses, head coachman, second coachman, carriage groom, 3 stablemen, and a chauffeur. Breakfast in the steward's room was regularly composed of beer and cold mutton. Doubtless, more than half the food sent to the dining room were returned uneaten downstairs to the benefit of those below. Miss Barford was our governess. When the news was broken that Sybil and I were to be sent away to boarding school, this came as quite a shock. I was 12 and a half, and Sybil was 15. Mary, Angela, and George were in or about to come into the schoolroom, and I suppose if we had stayed at home, it would have meant the cost of a second governess. Heathfield was the most fashionable school of the time, and the one to which my mother had originally thought of sending us. But when she saw what she considered to be an unnecessary and unsuitable lavishness of the clothes list, which was white silk frocks, white silk stockings, white satin pumps for dancing class, She dismissed it as a possibility. St. James, in contrast, called only for white cotton shirts and navy blue coats and skirts. The school was at West Malvern, Westernshire, an unusual Victorian house built by Lord Howard de Walden on the slopes of the Malvern Hills. There was a lovely view of the school, and it was surrounded by beautiful grounds and gardens, tended by a school of lady gardeners. Miss Alice Baird had charge of the senior house, and Miss Diana Baird, her sister, of the junior house, of 11 to 14 years old. Miss Bairds were remarkable. 5 spinster sisters, all over 6 feet tall, and all to be headmistresses. Our journey to the school for us was a great adventure. We traveled alone, usually breaking the journey to stay at night with our grandmother Gita at Castle Bromwich, an Elizabethan manor that still stands. But it is now lost in one of the busiest areas of Birmingham. Then it was surrounded by beautiful gardens, stretching away to a golf course and a small aerodrome. Alone, I was under age 1 and was allowed to join the senior school at St. James, so as to share a sister's room with Sybil. 4 little rooms were set aside for this purpose at the far end of the house, necessitating a lot of running to and from the main scene of the events, but having the advantage of being distant from all its noise and clatter. Miss Baird's did her best to make the school life as pleasant as possible. But nevertheless, it was something of a shock and a contrast to the comforts of home. The position of the house was exposed, and it could be bitterly cold. Eventually, in our bedroom annex, with 3 outside the walls and windows to the floor. Even in the winter, these windows had to be opened at night, and sometimes we would awake to find snow on the floor. It was cold in the classroom, too, because of the wartime shortages of fuel, and the quality of food was equally affected. Main meals seemed to consist of nothing but rissoles. I broke a tooth on a nail in my porridge. My brothers were even worse off at the front. They wrote continuously about the food. A letter from Billy in the summer of 1915 is typical. Billy writes, "Dear Alice, you might let my father know that several articles arrived safely. The viz, the fowl in the tin, 2 tins of sardine, 3 tins of herring, 1 tin of rolled ox tongue, many tins of cream cocoa, also such items as dubbin. We lived entirely on the tin stuff from England, as the only meat out here is pork, and the ration beef is not very tempting. The asparagus is very good, but the best of all was the fowl in the tin. What I particularly want is the tinned ham, or a big corned beef to have as midday meal, and some salad oil or mayonnaise sauce would be very useful. Cakes are also very useful. In fact, send the same as now, only more. We have a quiet time in the trenches with only a few casualties. I am only 12 to 16 miles from Walter, but cannot arrange to see him. Love from Billy." Letters were a rarity in the last war, everything being so heavily censored, whereas in the first war, everything was quite open. After lunch, Miss Baird would read us newspaper reports of the fighting. The death lists, which covered all ranks, were a daily horror, but nevertheless, we were not unduly anxious. It all seemed so far away from St. James. My father never wrote and no relatives came to visit us during our time there. We were more than thankful, for we felt very sure they would have disgraced us by saying or doing the wrong thing. Being philosophical, we realized we had to be at school, so we had better make the most of it and enjoy everything there has to enjoy. I was soon enrolled as a girl's guide, which I took very seriously, continuing my connection with the movement for many years later. I also greatly enjoyed the games and had no difficulty with the lessons. On arrival, I had been placed in a class of girls a year older than myself, but never found any trouble keeping up. There were no O levels or A levels in those days, and exams were not taken seriously. Citizenship was what Miss Bairds were most anxious to instill. It must be admitted with considerable success. Many girls were later notable for lives of public service. In my time, there were about 80 pupils, but I did not make any great friends. People never seemed to do so at school. To add to the enjoyment of our train journey, Sybil and I would used to take a little cardboard box with a hole in it. When anyone opened the door to come into the carriage with one of us would say nervously to the other, "I do hope the bees don't escape." We also had some terrible black mask which we would put on with our scarves and with our scarves tied around it. I think my cousin Charles Scott meant to be sarcastic when he wrote a poem for our family magazine about what a goody-goody I was. It began, "Alice was a really good girl who loved to go to school. The 5 Miss Bears called her their pearl, for never she broke a rule. A model was she for all the rest, and every day she did her best." Not so complimentary was the ruthless rhyme by Lord Ernest Hamilton, my great uncle. When Alice murdered Betsy Groots, the cunning girl wore Walter's boots. Detective Snooks from Scotland Yard measured the footprints' artful card. When I met Alice 6 years after, she told me as she shrieked with laughter, "I murdered Betsy," concealment scorning. "Walter was hanged for it this morning." So that's it. That's chapter 4. And I will pause there for the day. And that right here, as you can see, is the Duke of Buccleuch, the 7th Duke of Buccleuch. So, anyways, it's a good backstory. But Prince Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester, the maternal grandfather, he was the grandfather of Prince William of Gloucester, who died, and then Prince Richard of Gloucester. So